As I burst into the clearing of the dense jungle, I took a moment to take in my surroundings. Lush green vegetation from as far as the eye can see, steam steaming through the massive trunks of the banyan trees as the midday sun began to dry up the rain that was just lit up an hour ago. Here in Papua New Guinea, tropical rainstorms can start up in the matter of minutes. Then, just as quickly as they appear, they're gone, replaced by a scorching sun that will draw off your clothes in minutes. My team and I moved to an especially large banyan tree at the center of the clearing, and I began to scale it. It has been days since we embarked on our journey into the highlands, and I needed to get my bearings. One of the unique things about a banyan tree is the fact that it germinates new plants in its crevices, causing younger trees to grow out of the side, stretching across the trunk like a natural ladder of sorts, making it rather easy to climb. As I reached the top, I observed my surroundings, trying my best to make out landmarks and other possible vantage points. From what I could see, it appears we were nearing the end of our trek in the nearest village. Lima was only a day's journey away. Just one more night, I said to reassure myself. We can do this. I began to feel the fear begin to fade away as a small glimmer of hope found its way into my subconscious. That glimmer was extinguished immediately upon hearing a sharp sound from nearby in the underbrush. Oh God, I whispered under my breath. They're here. Shortly after graduating, I decided to take a few months to travel to the Pacific, spending most of my time backpacking the South Islands of New Zealand, the Samoan Islands, and Vanuatu. After countless months spent studying, attending classes, and various part-time jobs, it was nice just to take the time to see the sights, wandering the long roads and planning life one day at a time. There is something just special about the Pacific Island nations, each one unique in its own sort of way, and new experiences can be discovered at every corner. Each people group, from the Polynesian Moras of New Zealand to the Melanesian Nivians of Vanuatu, all come from hospitable cultures of rich island history, stories and legends passed down from generation to generation. You could spend hours sitting at a pub or cafe hearing story after story from the locals and learn about hidden gems and secret locations only known by those who've lived in the area that you would never find in a travel blog or website. It wasn't long before I heard about Papua New Guinea, a large island nation separated by the shallow Torres Strait from the rest of the Australian continent. I always thought that New Guinea was in Africa, said Trevor, a fellow backpacker from North Dakota whom I'd met a few days ago in a hostel in Dunedin, New Zealand. Of course you did, muttered David, a Brit from Liverpool. You Americans don't know the geography of any country unless it borders the US of A, he said mockingly, switching to a deep southern hillbilly accent near the end just to piss Trevor off. Oh, sod off, you bloody wanker, Trevor shot back while tossing an empty water bottle in his direction. The rest of us broke out in laughter at the interaction, including Stephen, an Indian Fijian who was on the lengthy vacation after working IT for a large computer company in Tauranga. Sasha, a native Kiwi from the North Island of New Zealand, and her newlywed husband Desmond, also from New Zealand, who were celebrating their honeymoon. Lastly, a graduated medical student from McMaster's University who was dreading the days my funds ran out and I had to inevitably return to my home in Ontario, Canada, just to begin looking for work in a medical field. Oh yeah, they call it the rising spirit of the Pacific, said the Norwegian tourist we had met shortly after arriving in New Zealand. We all sat together in a pub called the Crown and Badger, planning for the next few weeks of our trip. They have it all, he continued. Scuba diving, island retreats, hidden pools, jungle trails, you name it. It wasn't long before we unanimously decided that was our final destination before we took off on our separate ways. Shortly after arriving in Port Moresby, we asked the locals about local attractions, just to see if we could avoid some of the more crowded touristy locations. Scuba diving was out of the question during this time of year as the waters were rough, stirring up silt from the bottom, making it impossible to see. None of us were feeling like hitting the resorts either, as we all learned along the way that they were mostly always grossly overpriced. It wasn't long before one of the locals, a man named Solomon, told us of the Highland region. This location was not only home to hundreds of miles of island trails, but also some many hospitable villages whose locals, upon their arrival, would greatly accept us to spend a night with a hot meal in their nakamu, the natural center hut of their village where their elders would meet. It also doubled as a guest hut to any friendly tribesmen or foreigners who may be passing by. We all decided to make a trek east into the islands ending in Goraka and taking a private plane, owned by a family member of Solomon, just to take us to Port Moresby. We estimated this trip would take less than a week in total, which we would spend the remainder of the week relaxing on the beach at Port Moresby, drinking South Pacific export lager. Everyone seemed keen on this idea, aside from David, who would have rather skipped the whole jungle trek and just spent the last week on the beach before returning to foggy London. But after arriving and hearing the stories of hidden pools, ancient ruins, and breathtaking views, he eventually caved and decided to join us. Our first day on the trail was mostly uneventful. Being so close to the city's capital, we passed through several small villages, but the further we got from the cities, the fewer and fewer vehicles we noticed. Most people traveled by foot or on four-wheelers or dirt bikes. By the end of the day, we stopped at a small village right on the outskirts of the highlands we were about to cross into. According to my GPS, Stephen said looking down at his device, This should be the last village before we enter the jungle. We should make camp here, I told the rest of the group. This is our last day in civilization, so we might as well enjoy it while it lasts. I spent the rest of the day double-checking my backpack to see if we had everything, exploring the village and buying some Cliff Bars and water bottles from the local corner store. A small wooden hut with a thatched roof and an old Coca-Cola sign from the 70s out front. Bad time of year to be traveling through the highlands, said the store owner, an elderly Papuan woman with frizzy gray hair. Because of the rainy season? I asked her curiously. She paused slightly before answering. Yes, rain, she said, with a glassy look in her eyes. Rain brings mud, mud brings trouble, trouble brings pain. I nodded, only half listening. We should be alright. We're not planning on spending too much time in the mountains, I assured her, far away from any mudslides. She gave me a half smile and nodded her head, then shuffled back to resume fanning herself with a fan made of dried leaves. As I walked outside, I observed the rest of my friend's interaction with the villagers. Trevor, being the gentle giant, he quickly became the center of attention with the children. They all stood around him in a big circle, giggling and whispering to each other in their native language. Desmond walked out with a soccer ball tucked under his arm. He had purchased it a while back and left it deflated in his backpack. Just in case of an emergency game of footer, he always told us. As the two men began to initiate the game with the children, I saw Satya sitting off to the side with some girls from the village. One of the girls brushed her long blonde hair with some kind of comb and began attempting to braid it. The other girls stood close by watching in wonder, as many of them have never seen foreigners this close before. They would occasionally reach out and touch her hair, marveling at how different it was from their own. It's a good way to get headlines, muttered David in his usually grumpy tone. Seriously, David? Satya said annoyingly. I'm just saying, he said defensively. I've seen their bathrooms. Not a single shampoo bottle in sight. Why don't you just go piss off then? She retorted in her thick Kiwi accent. Go find somewhere else to sulk and moan. David snorted and began to trudge off to the central hut where we were staying. I watched Stephen as he began to rig his camera drone to a car battery, borrowed from one of the villagers. Several men stood by and watched, marveling at this sleek white miniature aircraft. A loud screech suddenly erupted from the skies, and an involuntary jolt shocked my body. I looked up instinctively toward the source of the sound as I saw a dark-winged figure fly over my head. I ducked down low and watched as the cat-sized bat flapped its wings and quickly returned to its perch in the trees. Bro, did you see the size of that thing? Asked Stephen, ran up to get a better look. The flying rodent looked back at us with its dark, beady eyes. That's a Pacific fruit bat, he said in amazement. I'd never seen them that big back in Fiji. We all observed it for a few minutes when the sound of a gunshot broke the silence. Satya screamed in horror and the large bat fell screaming only a few feet from where she was sitting, a thin stream of blood splattering on her pant leg. Desmond quickly ran to her side and began to console his screaming wife as one of the men from the village casually walked up with a machete in his hand and a rifle slung over his shoulder. He quickly ended the fruit bat's suffering with a quick jab between the shoulder blades, and the bat went rigid, and then limp. He then knelt down and picked it up and walked off, shooting me a satisfied rotten-toothed smile. Well played, I chuckled. I had to admire the man's marksmanship. I mean, given the fact that the bat had been at least 40 meters away from where he stood. The man then called it to his friends sitting in the shade of the jungle canopy, which resulted in them cackling with laughter. Probably a joke at the traumatized foreigner's expense. That evening, under a red sky, we all sat with a few of the village elders seated in a circle in the Nakamo where our sleeping bags and mattresses were set up for the night. We chatted with them through a translator, one of the village girls who spoke English, as they filled us into their village's history. A coconut shell was passed around with a brownish liquid inside that resembled muddy water. Stephen reached out excitedly and took a sip, handing it to me. Try it, he urged excitedly. It's kava, grounded from a local root. Taking the shell gently from his hands, I took a small sip of the earthy drink. Kava was very popular in the islands of the Pacific. The effects were similar to a light sedative, relaxing the muscles and putting your mind at ease. A lot of towns serve their drinks in specialized kava bars where people go to relax at the end of the day. I felt the effects a few minutes later after the shell made its way across the table. As my muscles began to relax, I leaned back on one of the poles holding up the grass roof of the building and tuned into one of the stories the elders were telling. Years ago, back before Papua New Guinea was discovered by Dutch sailors, a local tribe living in the highlands called the Osoros were at war with a rival tribe. After facing mass genocide at the enemy's hands, the Osoros were forced to flee into the river. There they waited in the mud while the rival tribe searched for them. For days they hid, while slowly one after the other, each villager drowned in the mud. Most afraid of the suffering that would be inflicted upon them caught by their rivals than they were of drowning. A few days later, the enemy tribe reported that forms of mud-covered men rising from the muddy banks and trudging through the jungle. Thinking that the figures were spirits, they fled in fear back to their home. For weeks, the villages were set upon by these mudmen. Dozens of men and women and children disappeared after straying too far from their huts in the middle of the night. After seeking help from a local shaman, they held a special ceremony to ward off these spirits. Even to this day, the Azores River and its surrounding areas are avoided by travelers and farmers, as the stories of the mudmen were passed on from generation to generation. I felt a shudder as I remembered the words of the elderly shopkeeper from earlier that day. Rain brings mud. Could this story be what the woman was referring to when she learned of our plans of crossing to the Azore territory? Mud brings trouble. It's so strange how folklore could still have such a strong effect on the local imagination even after all these years. Trouble brings pain. My attention was soon diverted to a group of women emerging from the smoking huts where our meals were being prepared. My stomach growled instinctively as the smell of meat wafted through my nostrils. Fish and rice were placed on the table on banana leaves as the smell of freshly cooked meats began to fill the hut. David reached out to begin filling his leafy plate. "It's about time," he said hungrily. "I'm so hungry I'll settle for anything." The translator gently grabbed his hand before it could reach the food. "No, sir," she said urgently. "This food is not appropriate for honored guests." David sat back, confused and slightly irritated. "Here is your food now," she said as one of the women walked up with a large platter with a light sheet covering it, and then placing it in front of the 6 of us. "Well, let's have at it then," David said impatiently, lifting the sheet off the plate. To our collective horror, what greeted us was the familiar set of claws, fangs, and the black wings that we saw earlier today. The fruit bat, in all its freshly cooked glory. "Bloody hell," David shouted as he backed up from the furry cuisine before him. "You've got to be joking," Trevor laughed. I glanced at the elders seated at the table, each one wearing a seriously yet puzzled expression. Stephen leaped in, speaking in a very low voice. "They are dead serious," he said quietly. "The Papuan people culturally are extremely generous and hospitable. Food plays a central role as it represents generosity and prosperity, and refusal of food is considered an insult to the host." I looked at him to see if he was joking, but his face was just as serious as the elders seated around us. A few more tense moments passed before Desmond broke into a polite smile and told the translator to let the elders know that we are extremely honored to be served this meal. He then gingerly reached out with his hand and began to tug on the left wing of the bat, as if it were a chicken wing. "Not like that," the translator said gently. "Like this." She reached out, pinching a tuft of fur from the bat's midsection, then twisting slightly, tearing a small chunk of meat from the rodent's carcass. Desmond gulped uncontrollably and then reached out and took off a chunk for himself. He slowly raised a piece of meat to his mouth and nibbled at it slowly. I saw him lurch slightly after chewing the stringy meat before catching himself and swallowing quickly. He smiled at the elders while nodding at them approvingly. They all smiled and began to resume their dinner-time conversation. Desmond then motioned for us to dig in, nudging David especially hard while whispering between clenched teeth, "Remember, we're all in this together." As each of us began to pull the meat by the tuft of fur, I did my best to pick away at the large furry rodent as best I could. Tastes like chicken," Trevor joked while gingerly picking out a few loose hairs out of his mouth as inconspicuously as he could. "In all honesty, fruit bat tastes exactly like it smells. And that smell is piss. Do you ever walk into a bathroom that smells so strong of urine that you can taste it in your mouth? Yeah, that's what bat tastes like. But hey, carpe diem, right?" The next day we said our goodbyes to the friendly villagers. Gifts were exchanged. Each of us were giving small trinkets and bracelets to remember our time together. Desmond gave the soccer ball to the children before leaving, and most surprisingly, David was given a large necklace made from pink flowers. According to the translators, this was a gift only received by chiefs and head of hunting parties. Of course, this immediately got to David's head as he began to refer to himself as Chief David for the remainder of the day. "You look pretty in pink," said Sasha mockingly. "Really brings out your eyes." We didn't hear much from Chief David after that comment. The rest of the day we made quick progress through the dense jungles of the highlands. Each stretch of land looked like it come straight from a scene of Indiana Jones movies. The land was rich with green vegetation, many trees bearing fruit such as mangoes and papaya. Or as Trevor called it, forbidden fruit, after the effects it took on his bowels after overindulging on his first day. It was no wonder so many battles were fought over this land. This place was his very own Garden of Eden. Stephen eventually activated the camera drone and began to fly it over the thick jungle canopy. We all gathered around him watching the screen of his phone as he flew it just a couple of 100 meters ahead of us. "I'm pretty sure that's cheating," said Trevor jokingly as the Azores River came into view. "Should be about a day's journey before we reach the river," Stephen said, ignoring Trevor's comment. "Looks like a rainstorm is approaching though." "Ah, great," whined David. "And here we could have spent the last week on the beach in the sun. But no, we had to get ourselves trapped in a tropical rainstorm in the middle of a jungle." That night as we slept under the cover of camping tarps and lean-tos Desmond and I put together, I sat and watched as the rain poured down heavy sheets like waterfall. Lightning flashed across the sky and thunder roared, shaking everyone out of sleep from time to time. Sasha lies next to Desmond, her head resting on his shoulder as he held her close, trying to keep her as dry as possible in the rainstorm. David sat closest to the center of the tarp, sleeping like a rock, possibly the only one who managed to keep dry, as Trevor's bulky frame lay shivering next to him, half of his body exposed to the rain. Stephen sat next to me in the lean-to playing an iPhone game, obviously having just as hard of a time of getting to sleep as I was. As the lightning lit up the sky and the rain poured around us, the woman's words once again rang out in my mind. Rain brings mud. I watched as I thought I saw a few pair of glimmering eyes in the trees above us. I shone my flashlight in the direction. Mud brings trouble. As my light shone in the trees, I was greeted by the sight of a half-dozen fruit bats, all staring at us with the unblinking, beady eyes. Trouble brings pain. When we awoke the next day, while packing up our camp and setting off in the direction of the river, we were greeted by a dense mist as the sun began to drop the rainwater from the night before. It's almost as if it's still nighttime, I said to no one in particular. Yeah, well, welcome to every other day in London, said David sarcastically. Stephen cursed as he looked down at his screen. I'm not getting a signal over here. Must be out of the range of the nearest cell tower. Well, it looks like we have no choice but to rely on good old-fashioned compass and map, said Trevor, ever the optimist. As we made our way through the jungle, eventually we could hear the sounds of water running. We should be getting close to the river, I called back to the rest of the group as I led the way. As soon as we make it to the river, we should follow it upstream until we reach our destination. Upon reaching the river, we retrieved our water bottles from our backpacks and began to fill them with water from Stephen's water filter. I'll be right back, Trevor called as he began to make his way upriver. Nature calls. For the love of God, please don't do whatever you're planning on doing upstream, Sasha moaned. After a few seconds, we were all jolted to our feet as Trevor shouted in terror. Des and I got to our feet and dashed up to where Trevor stood, struggling to pull his pants up while facing the water bank. What happened? I asked. Trevor stumbled over his words and just pointed to the riverbank. There lie the remains of a decomposing human body, half submerged in the river. Its arms and torso resting limply on the riverbank where the legs floated lazily on the water current. I swore as the realization suddenly hit me for what I was looking at. Sasha, don't come over here, Des yelled over his shoulder. Sasha, ignoring him, walked over and looked at the body, her already fair skin growing even paler than before. We all sat there for a few good minutes before anyone said anything. Could have been an accident, I said. A hunter who lost his footing and drowned in the river. This was no accident, Stephen said, taking a few steps closer to the body. Those marks on his back. Looks like he was attacked by something. Maybe rather than playing CSI New Guinea, we should get out of here, David said urgently. We can't just leave him out here like this, Des said, moving towards the body. Leave it, urged Sasha. I can't believe it, but I'm actually with David on this one. He's right. We can notify the island authorities once we get to civilization. Come on, urged Des to Stephen while grabbing one of the arms. Let's get him out of the river. Just as Stephen knelt to grab the other arm, I noticed movement in the water just a meter or so away from the body. Des, move! I shouted as I dove forward, grabbing the man by the front of his rain jacket and pulling him back from the lake bed as a large snout burst from the water. Its jaws clamped just inches away from where he was standing milliseconds ago. Crocodile! Stephen shouted, and he ran to Desmond's other side and helped him to his feet. Together, the three of us pulled our stunned friend to safety as the angry croc looked at us hungrily for a few moments before snapping out of the dead man's arm and dragging him into the water. I owe you one, mate, said Des, clapping a hand on my shoulder. I didn't even see him coming. A few milliseconds and I could have been him, he said, pointing to the corpse, whom the large reptile now held in his jaws as it began the death roll in the shallows of the water, kicking up mud and silt obscuring the gruesome sight. I never knew saltwater crocodiles could be found this far out from the sea, Stephen said in astonishment. Well, we know now, I said grimly. That night, as we made camp a fair distance from the river, as to prevent running into another scaly killing machine, I talked to Stephen in hushed tones. There is something I noticed about the body before the crocodile dragged it away, he said to me quietly. Those wounds in his back could not have been made from a crocodile. I know, I said. I think we all know, but some of us are just afraid to admit it. My mind thought back on the wounds on the man's back. 5 deep gouges right in between his shoulder blades, almost like a 5-pronged spear. My mind flashed back to the villager stabbing the fallen bat with his machete in the exact same spot. That sickening crunch, the wings going rigid and then dropping lifelessly to its side, the light leaving its eyes as it drew its last breath. The next day we moved onward, deeper into the highlands. As we began to make our way through the mist, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Do you know that sixth sense you sometimes have? That hair prickling on the back of your neck? A shiver running through your body? Your heart picking up its pace? Yeah, that feeling. We grew silent as the sound of the distance could be heard. Skylar, did you hear that? Asked David in a hushed tone. Yeah, I'm glad I'm not the only one, I responded. I heard it last night too, he whispered. There is something out there, and whatever it is making that noise. We heard again as David shut his mouth and we began to continue down the trail. That night I woke to a pricking sensation on my left cheek just below my eye. Opening my eyes carefully, I suddenly felt hundreds of tiny little legs clamp down on my cheek almost defensively. I slowly looked down, trying my best not to move any of my facial muscles as I caught sight of what appeared to be two large antennae feeling around cautiously around the edges of my eyelashes. It was then I suddenly realized what my uninvited guest was. A Goliath centipede, at least 8 inches long, set from my cheekbone to my jawline. I remember first hearing about these when researching the local wildlife on the flight over here. A fully grown Goliath centipede can grow up to 12 inches in length, so large that it could easily prey on reptiles and small birds twice its size. It also had a venomous bite that, although not lethal, hurt so much that there were stories from locals about the pain being so severe and excruciating that people had attempted to cut off the very limb that was bitten just to relieve the pain. Then here one was, sitting right on my face, its pincers only inches away from my eye. I stayed still for several seconds as I eventually worked up the courage to slowly raise my hand to swat it off my face as fast and as accurately as I could. I had only one shot at this. If I wasn't able to swat it off in one quick strike, I could potentially be dealing with one of the most painful bites of my life, right into one of the most delicate areas of my body. As I eventually drew in one last breath, and then struck out as hard as I could, swatting that giant arachnid off my exposed face, and then I proceeded to beat down the writhing creature with a cooking pot until it no longer moved. I stared at the crushed remains for a long time. Needless to say, I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, my eyes searching the darkness for movements. I thought I could see just out of the corner of my eye, something making that infernal clicking noise over and over again periodically as the night went on. The next day, to my horror, we were greeted by the sight of dozens of muddy footprints surrounding our camp. Some of them, close enough to reveal the perpetrators, were standing right above us as we slept during the night, without any one of us noticing. Muddy handprints also surrounded the campsite, on the lower part of the trees, on our tarps, and worst of all, on some of our very own sleeping bags we were in that night. Something or someone was with us all night, and I'm almost certain the intentions were not to check up on our well-being. After packing up our camp, we began our journey once again, making sure not to stray too far from our little group. It had been a while since the last rainfall, so the fog was gradually beginning to lift. Stephen took the opportunity to fly his drone over again to try and get a look at our surroundings, and possibly get our first glimpse of what was following us in the mist. As the drone flew over the treetops, Stephen called us over as we all gathered around the screen. "I saw movement over here," he said, pointing to a spot on the screen. "I'm gonna get a closer look." As the drone got closer and closer to what appeared to be a human figure standing on the bank of the river, it became clear what exactly we were looking at. An effigy of a human body held up by a pike. Its body made up of several branches and straw, river reeds weaved around it holding it together. The head was that of an animal skull. Upon closer investigation, it appeared to be that of a wild boar, its large tusk giving it away. "Whoever made this must have been from the same group who had been stalking us," I said. "I don't understand," said Stephen. "The figure I saw was moving. This isn't what my camera picked up." He was cut off suddenly when the drone spiraled out of control and fell to the ground, almost as if it had been swatted out of the air. Wait, where did that come from?" he stammered. We watched the last few seconds of the footage from the broken lens as a pair of feet came into frame. Human feet, bare and covered in dry gray mud. We watched in curiosity as the feet began to approach the fallen drone. It stepped so silent, not even the sound of broken twigs and leaves could be heard crunching beneath them. "It's so quiet," I muttered. "It's no wonder we can never hear them approaching." "Maybe just the mic was damaged in the crash," Stephen said, his voice containing the slightest hint of skepticism. "No living thing could move that silently." My heart raced when that familiar clacking sound was then picked up from the phone's speaker. "Why does it keep making that noise?" asked Sasha fearfully. Then we heard it again. This time it wasn't from the live feed. It sounded like it was only several feet away from where we stood. We all turned to its direction, and I could have sworn I could see a figure shrouded by the mist staring at us, unmoving, as still as a corpse. The clacking sound then sounded again, this time to our right, then one last time directly behind us. They're communicating with each other. I said as a realization hit me like a ton of bricks. It's their language. I took the first watch that night with Trevor. In my hands I held a makeshift spear I carved using my Leatherman, a gift from my father as a graduation present. I thought back to all those survival camping trips we went on together. All of the knowledge he passed on to me and what to do in every outdoor circumstance. Everything from how to find true north to crafting your own hunting gear. There were not many options given our circumstances and the short time we had. No time to carve a bow, and the most I could do was sharpen a few long sticks, burn the tips of the lighter to harden them, crafting just makeshift spears. I also managed to wedge a disc-shaped stone in between sturdy forked branches, crafting a club. Given his size and build, Trevor was the only one strong enough to swing the club with some efficiency. He sat with it sitting across his legs as he monitored our dark surroundings. I wish my father were here now, I thought to myself. He would know what to do in this situation. He would be able to make sense of everything. I stopped and then went back on that thought. Would he though? I mean, could anyone make sense of this situation? Could anyone be prepared for what might happen next? Look, I heard Trevor say between clenched teeth. He then motioned with his head in the direction of what appeared to be an outline of a human in the mist. The figure was crouched low, moving slowly and carefully, its figure thin and emaciated, its arms outstretched at shoulder length, its fingers unnaturally long and pointed. The most unnerving thing about its appearance, though, was its oversized head. It appeared to be twice the size of a normal human head. It moved silently, making no natural sound as it moved. No sound of breathing or even the slightest sound of footsteps can be heard from it. I stand by Stephen's original statement. No living being can be that quiet. This had to be something beyond our understanding. Came that sound from somewhere out of sight, and then the one in front of us froze for a few seconds. To our surprise, it responded by snapping rapidly its long pointed fingers together in quick succession, creating that mysterious clacking noise we had been hearing all day. After several exchanges back and forth between the solitary figure and its friends deeper in the mist, the lone figure began moving backwards, its focus never leaving our direction. Before we knew it, we were once again alone. Or, we'd like to think we were. The next day being the clearest day we'd had since reaching the Source River, we immediately set out moving at a jogging pace, sometimes sprinting to try to put as much distance between us and our pursuers. "Stop! Please, stop!" Sasha called from behind us. "Let's take 10, I yelled to David and Trevor, who were just a few paces ahead of me. We all stopped and began to catch our breaths. "Look at this," Steven said, handing me his iPhone. What he showed me was a loop of the drone footage in slow motion. Right when the drone was struck down, what I saw was a blurry image of what appeared to be the thing's face. My heart began to race as I zoomed in to get a better look. Its eyes appeared to be hollow, containing no eyeballs in its empty socket. Much like a human skull, it also appeared to have exaggerated facial features as well, its skin a pale gray, just like the feet we saw before. "That can't be its real face," I said after watching the loop several times and handing the screen back to him. "It has to be some kind of tribal mask," Steve said. "It bears a similar resemblance to the ones worn in Fiji during ceremonies worn by our ancestors. And that body paint must be used as some sort of camouflage," I added. It did its job, considering they were nearly invisible in the mist. Perhaps that's why they never strayed too far out of it. Almost out of fear of being spotted. "Come on," David called out patiently. "If you sit around much longer, we'll be joining our friend on the riverbank." He had a point. The more time we wasted, the less distance put between us and the hunters. The events that follow are what brought me to the top of that banyan tree as I mentioned before. "Skylar," I heard the others call from below. "Get down here, they're coming." It was then that I noticed that within a few minutes of me being up in the tree, the mist was already beginning to seep down from the damp earth, and the sun began to dry the previous rainfall. I heard they began to make my way down the tree, careful not to let my feet slip on the damp surface. As I looked down to search for the rest of the team, I realized that the mist had now become so thick I couldn't even see the ground. "Trevor? Dez? David?" I called, trying my best to keep my voice low. No one answered. Is it possible they were forced to take off before I was able to make it down? I thought to myself. Maybe they just can't hear me over the jungle ambience. It was just then that I caught sight of Trevor. The large man sat crouched behind one of the many trees near the bottom of the banyan tree. He waved his arms in my direction. I signaled back to him to acknowledge that I could see him. I then held my palms up in the universal sign for, "What in the heck is going on?" He responded by pointing the direction of what appeared to be two unconscious figures being dragged off into the mist. Satya and Dez. I knew it was them because I noticed Satya's long blonde hair from where I stood. I watched in horror as my two friends were dragged off by two gray figures until they were completely out of sight. My thoughts immediately went back to the whereabouts of the rest of the team. Were they captured as well? Were Trevor and I the only ones left? My next thought was on the rest of the hunters and where they were, and if there were more of them searching for the remaining members of my group. As I began to continue down the enormous mass of tangled branches, when I felt my foot slip slightly at an unusually slippery branch. I reached out to catch myself, and I noticed the familiar sight of a human handprint right above my head. A gray handprint. I turned around just in time to come face to face with one of them. He stood only several feet away from where I held on, its body unnaturally still, its masked expression as somber as its empty eyes. I instinctively jumped back as his long clawed hand reached out at me. Several of the long-fingered claws cutting into my shirt as I felt my feet slip off the edge of the branch. As I watched the world spiral out of control, I felt the impact from one of the lower branches catch me in the shoulder, the next one on my midsection, and then finally in the side of my head as I blacked out. The last thing I could remember was the sight of two gray, pale feet slowly approaching me as my world slipped away into darkness. As I woke up groggily, I felt as if every bone in my body was broken. It was dark, yet from where I was sitting, I could see several figures standing in front of me. As my vision cleared, I immediately recognized several of the crouched figures are the ones that were hunting us. I cursed loudly and tried to stand on my feet as I felt the coarse ropes burn into my wrist. I winced in pain and then looked up at my hands tied firmly above my head to a wooden pillar. I looked up just in time to catch a glimpse of what was making that noise. I observed the one standing close to me, clenching its clawed hands together, creating that clacking sound that we have been hearing over the past few days. The one next to it replied by repeating the same motion, this time in a different sequence. It was then I realized that their hands were not claws like I originally thought. Attached to each of their fingers were long pieces of bamboo, sharpened to points, almost like a gauntlet of sorts. Their skin was also covered from head to toe in grayish clay. Even their exaggerated masks with the ever-so-grotesque facial features seemed to be coated in a layer of it. It was no wonder they blended in so well in their surrounding fog. They almost looked like ghosts from a distance. Aside from their masks, they wore no clothes and their feet were bare. Turns out the legends of the so-called mudmen were not myths at all. As night fell, I witnessed many more mudmen appear out of the fog. Over the past few hours, I concluded that we were standing at the edge of a river, near a small fjord in one of the wider parts. All around me stood those straw men decorated with skulls of multiple animals such as crocodiles, boars, birds, and even monkeys. Also, to my slight amusement, I noticed that the half-destroyed drone sitting on the shoulders of one of the straw figures as well. It didn't take long to realize that each of the many strawmen had their skeletal heads turned to face me and the other two wooden pillars. My heart began to race as I suddenly realized that this was no holding center for trespassers. The onlookers were not here to observe their captors. They were here to attend a ritual. I noticed to my left and right lay Desmond and Sasha, also tied to their respective poles. I then realized to my horror what exactly the commotion was about, as I was approached by two especially frail-looking mudmen. Judging from what I could see in the dim moonlight, they were women. One carried a blade, the other a man-made bowl of a grayish substance that I soon realized was the very same mud they had covered themselves in. They stripped us of our clothes and covered every inch of our body with its viscous sludge. It burned my eyes, and the smell of it was worse than anything I had ever smelled in my life. It smelled like a mixture of rotting flesh and chemicals, and it stung as it began to dry over my exposed flesh. After waiting for about an hour or so for the mud to dry, one of the mudmen began to slowly clack its clawed bamboo gauntlet in a slow, rhythmic fashion. Soon, more and more of them began to join in, almost in perfect unison, as if it was just some non-verbal chant. The noise began to pick up pace as two of the larger members of the tribe suddenly began to move forward in Sasha's direction. She screamed in terror as she violently tugged against her restraints. Even in the pale moonlight, I could see her wrist beginning to bleed as her skin was torn. Her horrid screams intensified as I reached her and began to cut her restraints. Whatever they had planned for us, she was next. "Get away from her!" I heard Desmond shout as he suddenly darted forward from his seated position. He thrust his arm forward towards the two figures, with what appeared to be his trusty Swiss Army knife slicing the arm of one of the closest figures. The mudman jumped back, taking a defensive position with its clawed hands at its chest like a boxer. A thin strand of dark blood began to seep from a deep gash in its forearm where the blade struck. The second figure was unable to react as fast, catching the blade right below its bottom jaw, right into its jugular. The thing fell to the ground, thrashing and twitching like a snake with its head cut off. I watched in horror as the sailor's being eventually laid still as almost black blood drained from its open wound, slow and thick. I drew my attention back to Dez as it gained the upper hand on the second mudman. He knelt with one knee on the chest of the fallen figure, reaching down to grasp at its head, sinking both of his thumbs into his eye sockets. Ignoring the claws digging right into his forearm, trying desperately to pry itself free. Dark liquid began to pool behind its head as its thrashing also began to slow, just as the other one did, mirroring its silence. Dez quickly stood to his feet and limped over to Sasha, kissing her on the forehead while holding her face in his hands. "It's gonna be okay, baby," he said, his voice shaking from the adrenaline. "We're gonna make it out of this, just—" His voice was cut short as one of the mudmen rushed from behind, sinking its claws deep into his back, its pointed bamboo fingertips sticking slightly out from the front of his chest. He let out a small strangled gasp as he looked me in the eyes in horror and then back at Sasha. She screamed in agony at the sight of her newly wedded husband falling to his knees. The thing then pulled his clawed hand free and tossed the dying man to his side. I watched as the last few agonizing breaths escaped my friend's lips. He looked me straight in the eyes until suddenly the light drained from his and he fell silent. The clacking chant intensified as two of the figures began dragging Sasha. She was conscious but in a state of shock upon witnessing her husband's death. As she was brought to the center of the shallow river's edge, the two figures forced her to a kneeling position in the mud up to her hips. They then walked back slowly to the riverbank, as the chant began to suddenly pick up to a rapid succession until every noise of the jungle was drowned out by their own noise. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they all stopped, standing as still as the three corpses laying in front of me. I stood and watched Sasha's trembling form. I looked around desperately for something sharp, some object, anything that I could use to save her, but there was just nothing in reach. Suddenly, something caught my eye in the foggy river. Something moving just out of sight in the fog. Something large. Something very large. The still waters began to churn as large ripples began to spread out from something rising out of the center of the river, its figure towering over even the tallest of trees. I don't know if my vision was obscured by the mist, or if my mind could just simply not comprehend what I was seeing. Its long, bloated body slowly rose from the muddy riverbed, but the way it stretched and dragged its gargantuan bulk eerily reminded me of a massive worm. The mud slowly began to slide from its body, falling in giant clumps. Just then, two pincer-like jaws slowly slid from the front of the giant beast's head, its tips sharp and jagged like the claws of a crab. The dark figure slowly leaned in to observe the shaking clay figure sitting before it. I could hear her muffled sobs escape her lips as she was suddenly shaken out of her haze. Suddenly, a loud clicking sound escaped from what appeared to be the creature's pincers in a manner similar to the way the mudmen communicated. A disturbing thought crossed my mind. Was this thing somehow communicating to its human subjects? The clacking then slowed down to a stop as it slowly began to lean forward, its jagged pincers closing to my friend's position. Suddenly, the wind picked up as I saw the creature in its full form. I had to look away in horror as I briefly took in exactly what was in the river. Its mud-covered flesh was thick and smooth, almost like an amphibian. Its color as dark and gray as the mud covering my very own flesh. Every inch of the creature's body was covered in pore-like holes, spaced out only inches apart like some kind of trypophobic nightmare. I forced myself to look away. The very sight almost hurt, on a physical level to even look at, even for a few seconds. In the center of its head was this endless pit with jagged teeth lining the sides similar to that of the Sarlacc pit from Return of the Jedi. The very center was also where the clicking sound originated. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to forget the images as I heard Sasha's last screams as whatever happened to her took place only several meters away from where I lay. I couldn't even imagine the pain my friend went through. And my mind began to race as I realized I was next. The two figures who slaughtered my friend in cold blood and sacrificed the other began to approach me as the rest of the tribe ran forward to the edge of the river. They began scooping up handfuls of the slimy globs of that pale gray clay, from which I realized was now oozing from the beast's pores. The same substance that now covered every inch of my own flesh. I shuddered at the thought. I closed my eyes as the one with the blade knelt before me, reaching for my tied wrists. This is how it ends. This is how I die, I thought to myself as I imagined the creature's large pincers cutting into my flesh. Suddenly, I felt a cold liquid splash on my face and bare chest as I heard what could have been mistaken for a ripe watermelon being smashed with a baseball bat. I opened my eyes just in time to witness the twitching figure fall at my feet like a rag doll as Trevor's bulky figure came into view, wielding the stone hammer. The second mudman rolled expertly to his side as he was swung at, aiming right for the middle of his torso. The mudman then crouched low like a predator ready to strike when suddenly a third figure came into view. David ran forward out of the underbrush, jamming a charcoal spear right into the mudman's back as the mad Brit pinned it to the ground while Trevor finished it off with one single crack to the skull with his hammer. I felt two hands reach behind me as Stephen began to viciously cut at my bindings. A bellowing moan then sounded from the center of the lake, as gusts of mist began to shoot out of the pores in the creature's flesh, shrouding it almost instantly in a thick haze as the tribe suddenly broke from their trance, staring at us almost as if in surprise. "Time to go," said Trevor as he began to pull me up shakily to my feet. As my mind finally switched to the fight-or-flight mode, given the fact that we were severely outnumbered, we decided on the latter. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me. I barely felt the dozens of scratches and sharp rocks digging into my exposed skin as I ran for what felt like hours, almost in complete darkness as the mist began so thick I could barely see my hands in front of me. It took the others to practically restrain me to get me to stop so they could catch their breath. Where are the others?" said Trevor breathlessly. "Gone," I said, shaking my head as the vivid memories of Sasha and Desmond's last moments began to come back to life in a horrible nightmare. "They're just gone." I watched as the others took in the news, and they stood in silent sorrow for just a few moments. "And what was that thing?" said Stephen. "I just barely caught sight of it before it disappeared." "I don't know," I said as the image of the thing slowly became harder and harder to remember, almost as if it was only a bad dream. "And why the bloody hell are you naked?" added David, as he tossed me a spare set of clothes from his backpack. "I almost mistook you for one of them." After I got dressed and drained an entire water canteen to quench my thirst, we continued on our way to the outskirts of the highlands, our hearts racing as a familiar and unwelcoming sound of clacking then began to be heard in the surrounding foliage around us. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp pain exploded from my right shoulder as I was jumped from behind. The mudman, who I didn't even hear coming, had sunk its clawed bamboo gauntlet into my shoulder and then retracted its claws to begin to swipe again. I fell to my back and caught its clawed hand just inches away from my neck and called out to warn the others. I could hear them shouting and cursing as they too were ambushed moments after I was. I desperately grasped the tribesman, trying as hard as I could to pry its clawed hand away from me. I could feel the bamboo tips painfully cutting into me as it slowly began to overpower me. Having the upper hand and all of its body weight behind it left me at a severe disadvantage. I then twisted its wrist in one quick motion while simultaneously rolling onto my side with the bamboo tips digging deep in the muddy ground below me. I then struck it as hard as I could in the side of the head, right above the temple, causing it to split slightly. Suddenly, ignoring me entirely, the mudman began to clasp his hand over the cracked surface of his mask, almost like a diver covering up a leak in its oxygen mask. I saw this as an opening and tackled the struggling mudman, pinning him to the ground. I reached under the mask with my fingers and began to pry upwards. "Let's see what's under there," I said in anger as the dried clay began to give way from the man's face. To my surprise, for the first time since we encountered this savage tribe, I heard what I understood to be a vocal protest. The thing's scream did not sound like it was in pain, more like a scream of pure terror. If taking this thing's mask off was what was causing the screams of panic, then that was exactly what I was going to do. It was the least I could do for the suffering of my friends in the hands of these monsters. With one final pull, the mask suddenly broke off in a large chunk, revealing the face of the attacker. I had to jump back. I jumped back as I looked upon the face of one of the assailants for the first time. I looked in disgust at the same porous, slick, amphibious flesh as a giant river beast they served. Large holes resembling those of an empty lotus pod covering every inch of the man's face all the way down to his neck. I watched as they expanded and contracted with every breath like hundreds of small gills. There were even holes in the man's eyes. The creature laying at my feet, whom I no longer doubted was anything but human, lay still, breathing rapidly as what appeared to be long, hair-like appendages slowly began to emerge from the pores in its flesh. The tiny feelers began to latch on the damaged areas of the man's mask, pulling the pieces forward back into place. I had to look away as the sight made me nauseous. I looked up to the others, trudging toward my direction, their bodies cut and torn from the bamboo claws of the assailants. 3 other figures lay on the ground. 2 I recognized by their mud clay skin as the mudmen. The third by the light brown skin tone of my friend Stephen. I rushed to his side, realizing that he was still alive. He clutched at his blood-soaked midsection. "It's no use," he said with pain in his voice. He lifted his hands to slowly show me the gaping wound. My stomach lurched as I caught the slightest glimpse of his insides exposed in the moonlight. "Here, take this," he said, straining to reach inside of his shirt pocket. It's the SD card from the drone. I was able to retrieve it after we rescued you." I took it carefully from his blood-stained hands. "Show it to the authorities," he said weakly as his eyes began to drop shut and his head became heavy in my arms. "The world needs to know what happened. Do it for Desmond and Sasha. Do it for me." His voice trailed off as he drew his last breath and went limp in my arms. I felt the pain of regret in my chest as I once again watched one of my closest friends die right in front of me. I stood to my feet, slowly putting the small SD card in my pocket. From where the drone was positioned, it may have captured the whole ritual. Our only proof of everything that happened to us over the past few days was now in my hands, and it was up to me to make sure the world knew the truth of what happened. I turned just in time to witness David plunge his spear straight into the heart of the unmasked man. "That's for Desmond and Sasha," he said in cold rage in his voice. "Stephen too," I added. They both looked from me to our fallen friend with heavy hearts. "They will not take one more of us," I said. "We can't let them." The other 2 surviving members nodded in agreement as we continued through the jungle, leaving yet another one of our friends behind. As we continued to run through the foliage, I couldn't help but notice the world just didn't look right, almost as if I had vertigo. I witnessed movement where there was none. The world gradually began to tilt and spin as I realized to my horror that this wasn't just dehydration. The claws of those things must have been laced with some kind of poison. I looked at the others who also bore wounds from our last fight, and they also began to stumble, their pupils almost fully dilated. Then, to make matters worse, I began to notice a familiar clacking sound in the distance. They found us again. The first party was only there to weaken us. Now the rest were coming in for the kill. We ran as fast as we could, not even paying attention to our surroundings or what direction we were heading, as long as we could run faster than our pursuers. Suddenly, I was sent tumbling as my bare foot hit a tree branch. As I threw my arms forward to catch myself, I noticed the skin on my arms began to bubble as hundreds of small pores began to spread out across my flesh, the small hairs feeling around like thousands of legs of centipedes. I screamed and began to desperately scratch at my forearm, only to realize that my arm, although bloodied and bruised, was not covered in holes. The poison was causing us to hallucinate. As I got back to my feet and ran, I looked into the trees above me and their branches appeared to me moving lazily like tentacles of a jellyfish in an ocean current. White lights began to float around in my eyesight, always drifting into the corners of my vision as I tried to look directly at them. Suddenly, in the distance stood the towering figure of the river monster I saw before, looming in the distance among the trees. Still to this day, I do not know if that was just another hallucination or if the giant being was actually watching us run for our lives in the distance. "We're not going to be able to outrun them," Trevor said. "The only way we can escape is if we run and travel down the river." He pointed to the fast-moving water only a few meters away from where we stood. My heart raced as I began to feel dread about the thought of just what was inside that river. Soon, the rational part of my brain took over as I realized, though it was risky, it was the only way we were going to escape. Trevor and David ran up to a small pile of branches and leaves and began to uncover what appeared to be a small wooden canoe of sorts. "We found this shortly after we captured you," David explained. I knew this would come in handy," said Trevor, whose voice almost sounded like he was in a drunken stupor. Trevor bore the brunt of the wounds from our previous fight, so the poison from his wounds must have been affecting him more than myself and David. As we pushed the canoe to the bank of the river, the clacking sound grew louder. To my horror, I could once again begin to see several figures moving silently through the mist from every direction. "We aren't going to make it in time," I said to the other two. "I need to stay behind." "Are you mad?" David asked in astonishment. "They are going to kill you." I nodded grimly, acknowledging that I was aware that staying behind was a one-way trip. "If the two of you travel downriver, I should be able to hold them back long enough for the two of you to escape in time." "I'm not going to let you do that, Skylar," David yelled. "It's the only way," I replied as I bent down to retrieve our last spear that was laying at the semi-comatose Trevor's feet. Suddenly, I was struck from behind, suddenly falling headlong into the canoe, my mind spinning from the fresh blow to the back of my skull. David leaned in and pulled the spear to my hands. "If it's anyone who should be staying behind, it's me. I lost 3 friends today and I will not lose another," he said sternly. Before I could protest, he gave the canoe one last shove as the current took us, and we began to speed down the river. David then turned around, spear in hand, to face the surrounding mist closing in on him. "Go on then, have at me, you tosser," he shouted as the mist shrouded my view from witnessing his last stand. I slumped to the side and began to cry. I sobbed as all the fear, all the emotions I had repressed over the past few hours suddenly hit me like a flood, incapacitating me. It had only been a few days ago we were all set together in a hostel in New Zealand, having drinks and sharing stories of what brought us here on this trail. We talked for hours on end about our families, our lives, and our homelands. We shared secrets and dreams and even our deepest regrets. Although we had only spent a few weeks together, we became close friends, closer than friends. We were almost a dysfunctional family of sorts. Traveling together has an odd way of bringing complete strangers together. When I was finally able to calm down, I noticed the water began to pick up speed. As we began to pick up speed, I witnessed hundreds of human hands beginning to reach out of the water toward our boat, pushing us all down the river. Upstream, I witnessed a towering figure in the distance, slowly pushing itself in our direction. Not close enough to be in sight, but not far enough to not be a threat. I squeezed my eyes shut and shook my head in an attempt to clear the poison-influenced nightmare. That gargantuan beast was gone when I opened my eyes again. Just as I turned around, I caught a glimpse of a large rock just as the front of the canoe hit it head-on, causing Trevor and me to be tossed from the wooden refuge into the cold water of the Osorus River. My head broke the surface as I instinctively turned to face downstream, stretching my legs forward to catch any upcoming rocks on the path, just like I was taught by my father to do. I searched desperately for the raft and Trevor, but neither of them were in sight. Just then, I spotted the unconscious figure of Trevor just a small distance away from me. I kicked and swam as hard as I could in his direction. As I got closer, hundreds of hands once again appeared from below the surface and began to hold me back from me getting to him. I screamed out in anger and tried desperately to pry the hands from my body as I looked in the horror as most of them began to appear around Trevor and began dragging him under. "Please, let him go, just let him go," I begged as little by little, more and more of Trevor's bulky frame began to disappear below the surface, just out of reach of my outstretched arms. I watched as one hand finally clasped over his mouth, and he was finally dragged below. I screamed and cursed as the hands once again disappeared as the poison began to wear off. I then just gave up all hope and just let the river take me. The sounds of the rushing water and the sound of the jungle disappeared as my head sank below the surface. Rain brings mud. Mud brings trouble. Trouble brings pain. I heard the woman's voice in my head echo as I slowly drifted into unconsciousness. The first thing I felt as I awoke was the sun on my skin and the sound of jungle birds singing their strange yet beautiful songs. I sat up groggily from where I lay in the back of a wooden wagon being drawn by 2 large water buffalo. I looked around me to notice no sign of the jungle mist, nor the sound of the river rushing. I almost forgot what it felt like to feel the sun on my face again. I was then roused from my daydream by an elderly farmer who, along the side of the cart, spoke rapidly in a language I could not understand. I looked at him confused and put my hands up in the universal sign of, "I have no idea what you're saying." He then called to a young boy who was just a little ways ahead. He ran to the old man's side and they began to make a quick exchange in their dialect. The young boy then nodded and asked me, "You speak English?" "I do," I said quickly. "Where am I? Where are my friends?" The young boy took a moment to process what I asked and then translated the message to the older man. "Garaka," the child said. "My grandfather told me you were the only one he found." I sat up quickly, wincing in pain. "There were others, white fellas like me." I said, "White fellas being what the locals refer to as tourists." "No other," the boy repeated. "Just you laying by the river. We're bringing you to a hospital." I then just gave up and laid on my back, painfully closing my eyes once again. All of my friends were either missing or dead. I thought to myself as survivor's guilt began to settle in. I suddenly remembered Stephen's last words to me. "The world needs to know." I reached gently into my pocket and retrieved a small square SD card. A few weeks later, I sat in the small airport of Port Moresby, waiting for my flight to be announced. The local authorities were able to make a full report based on what I told them, and opened a full-on investigation into the missing tourist. The remains of Stephen, Sasha, Desmond were never discovered, and the whereabouts of Trevor and David remain unknown. From what the local officers told me, even if they did somehow escape, they wouldn't have survived longer than a day or two. The only reason I survived was that I was picked up and rescued by a local fisherman from the nearby village. I spent the better part of my recovery process in the hospital, on my laptop that was returned to me from our local hotel, documenting everything I could remember that happened to us over the last few days. And that brings me to where I am now, just about to upload this story online so the deaths of my friends would not be forgotten. So, when I return home after my layover in Indonesia, I can upload the video online for the world to see, so people can realize that there are things in this world we can't even begin to understand. Creatures that are hidden from public eye. I know that many of you reading this story may not believe it from what I can describe in words, but the proof will be undeniable once I upload the video. Unfortunately, I don't have the bandwidth to upload the video where I am now, but I plan to upload the video as soon as I get off this plane. I am ending this story now as my flight, Indonesian Airline Flight 307, just announced that regardless of the weather conditions being foggier than normal, they plan on leaving within the hour. As I conclude this story, I leave you with this one final message. There are still places and people left untouched by civilization. Creatures and monsters hiding the darkest recesses of the ever-so-shrinking world of mystery that the world used to be. Rest assured though, the truth always comes out. Sometimes it's right away and other times it's down the road. But understand, the truth always comes out. It's just a matter of time.